I was on my way to pick up medication for my sick wife when a truck ran a red light and put me in a hospital bed. I called my children. My son said, "Dad, we've been planning this trip for 8 months. We're not canceling it." Then he boarded his flight. From that hospital bed with one hand in a splint, I canceled the $4,900 I had been sending them every month. That same night, an elderly woman walked in carrying a red ledger and everything collapsed. Thank you for joining me. Drop your city or country in the comments right now to boost this story. Don't forget to subscribe to Dad's Revenge Stories. Please note some fictional elements were added for entertainment purposes. Resemblance to any names or settings is completely accidental, but the message shared is useful. My name is Raymond Calloway, and I have been keeping records my entire life. 31 years as a certified public accountant will do that to a person. I tracked columns of numbers the way other men tracked baseball scores automatically, instinctively, with a quiet satisfaction when everything balanced at the end. What I could not account for, what no ledger I ever kept had prepared me for, was the particular arithmetic of loss. The kind that does not announce itself until you are lying in a hospital bed at midnight, staring at a ceiling you do not recognize, counting the ways you got the numbers wrong. But I am getting ahead of myself. Every story has a beginning, and mine begins on a Tuesday afternoon in November in the kitchen of the house where Maggie and I have lived for 26 years. The kitchen smelled like the cinnamon candle she liked, the one I bought every October from the pharmacy on Junction Boulevard, without being asked. Maggie was sitting at the table near the window, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. She did that, sometimes held things she had forgotten she was holding. Parkinson's disease does not take everything at once. It takes things gradually, like a slow leak you keep meaning to fix, and one morning you realize the floor has been wet for years. "You don't have to go tonight," she said. Her voice was steadier than her hands. That was one of the things the disease had not taken yet, and I was grateful for it every single day. "The prescription ran out this morning," I said. I checked my coat pocket for my wallet, found it on the third try. "I'll be back before the news comes on." "You said that last time." "Last time there was a line." I crossed the kitchen and crouched down beside her chair, the way my knees reminded me I was 68 years old. I put my hand over hers, and she turned her palm upward and held on. Her grip was weaker than it used to be, but it was still hers. "Carol is right next door. She'll come over the second you call." She was a retired emergency room nurse who grew tomatoes in the summer and brought us soup in the winter without being asked. She was the kind of neighbor people in New York City spend their whole lives wishing they had. I had her number in my phone under the label Carol Next Door, because Maggie sometimes forgot last names now, and I wanted to make it as easy as possible. "I don't like to bother her," Maggie said. "She told you specifically that you are never a bother." She told me the same thing. She told us both at the same time at the dinner table using those exact words. I squeezed her hand gently. She meant it. Maggie looked at me with that expression she had developed over the last year, part amusement, part something more tender. The look of a woman who has decided to let herself be taken care of and is still surprised by it. "You and your exact words," she said. I kissed her forehead and stood up slower than I intended to. 15 minutes, I said. 20 at the most. I called Carol from the front porch. She answered before the second ring told me she would be over in 2 minutes, and she was. I watched her come up the front walk in her fleece jacket, waving at me like we were neighbors at a summer cookout, instead of two people managing a difficult situation on a cold November evening. "Go," she said. "I've got her. Take your time. I won't be long." "Ray." She said my name the way people do when they want you to stop arguing. "Go get the prescription." I got in the car. The drive to the pharmacy was 12 minutes on a good day. That afternoon, the sky had the particular gray of late autumn in Queens, not threatening, just settled and final. The way November skies in New York always looked to me like the city had decided to put on its serious face for a while. I took the expressway because the side streets were backing up near the school on Casena Boulevard. I thought about Maggie the whole drive. Not worrying exactly, I had learned in the past 7 years that constant worry was a form of exhaustion that helped no one, least of all her. I was thinking about the way she had held my hand at the table, about the cinnamon candle, about the fact that tomorrow I needed to call Dr. Patel's office to confirm the new dosage schedule, and that I had been meaning to reorganize the medication shelf in the bathroom because the labels were getting hard for her to read. I was thinking about all the ordinary logistics of love, the scheduling, the planning, the 100 small decisions that go into keeping another person safe when the traffic ahead of me slowed. Brake lights flickered on across 2 lanes. I eased off the accelerator. The road was damp from an earlier rain, and the evening commute was starting to build. I checked the clock on the dashboard. 5:42. I would make it back before 6. I did not see the truck until it was already in my lane. It came from the left, a delivery truck, running a red light, at the interchange moving too fast for the wet pavement, and when it struck the driver's side of my car, the sound was nothing like what I expected. It was not a crash so much as a concussion, a sudden erasure of the moment before. The car spun. I felt the seatbelt lock hard across my chest. The window beside my head became the ground, and then the sky, and then a concrete divider, and then nothing I could identify at all. When the car stopped moving, my first coherent thought was not about pain, though there was pain, a deep grinding pressure in my wrist, and a sharpness in my ribs that made every breath feel like a deliberate choice. My first coherent thought was about Maggie's medication, which was still sitting on the pharmacy shelf on Junction Boulevard, waiting for a prescription I had not yet filled. My second thought was her voice. "Don't be long, Ray." The light was green. I remember that clearly because it was the last thing I registered before the truck hit that small, ordinary green circle hanging in the gray November air, telling me I had the right of way, that everything was proceeding as it should. I have thought about that green light many times since. How much we trust those signals. How completely we believe that the rules we all agree to follow will protect us. They do not always protect us. The pain arrived before the understanding did. My wrist was wrong, I knew that before I could see it, before I could think the word fracture or process what had happened to the left side of my car. My ribs were worse. Every breath I attempted felt like someone was tightening a belt around my chest, one notch at a time, slow and deliberate and without mercy. I tried to sit up, and the world outside my windshield tilted hard to the right, and I understood then that I was not going to be sitting up on my own. There was glass on my lap. The driver's side window was gone. Cold air poured in from somewhere, and I could hear horns, not the ordinary impatient horns of New York traffic, but the sustained, alarmed kind that meant something had gone genuinely wrong in a public place, and everyone within a quarter mile knew it. Hey, sir, don't move, can you hear me?" A man was crouching outside the gap where my window had been. He was wearing a reflective vest and had both hands raised in the universal gesture of stay still, the kind of posture that people only assume when they are genuinely frightened of what you might do if you move. "My wife," I said. My voice came out wrong, thin and compressed, like I was speaking through a narrowed pipe. "I need to call my wife." "Sir, I need you to stay still. What's your name?" "Raymond. Raymond Calloway." I tried to move my right hand toward my coat pocket where my phone was. The movement sent a bolt of pain from my wrist straight up to my shoulder, and I heard myself make a sound I did not recognize, something involuntary and raw, the kind of sound a person makes when their body overrules their dignity. "My phone." I need my phone. My wife is home alone. We're going to get you help right now. Can you tell me where you feel pain? I wanted to tell him that the pain was not the point. That there was a woman sitting at a kitchen table in Queens with cold tea and trembling hands. And that Carol had said she would stay, but Carol had her own life. And that Maggie's evening medication had not yet been picked up from the pharmacy on Junction Boulevard. And that none of the people who had promised to help in exactly this kind of situation were anywhere near that kitchen right now. Instead, I said, "My chest, my left wrist, please. My wife has Parkinson's disease. She's home alone." He relayed something to someone behind him. I could not see who. The sirens I had been hearing from a distance were suddenly close, and then directly above me. And there were more voices, more hands, a neck brace that someone fitted around me with practiced efficiency while asking me to hold still. And then paramedics who moved with the particular focused calm of people who had seen worse than this and were determined not to let it become worse than this. One of the paramedics, young steady hands a name tag. I could not read in the fading light, leaned close and spoke clearly. "Mr. Calloway, we're going to get you out of the vehicle. I need you to tell me if anything changes, any new pain, any dizziness. You with me?" "My wife," I said again. It was becoming something close to a prayer. "Her name is Margaret Calloway. We live on 178th Street in Fresh Meadows. There's a neighbor named Carol 2 houses down. Please, someone needs to call Carol. We'll make the call, Mr. Calloway. You focus on breathing for me. Nice and slow." Breathing slowly was not as simple as he made it sound. Each inhale pulled against something in my chest that did not want to be pulled, and by the time they had me on a stretcher, I had developed the habit of taking very shallow breaths and releasing them carefully, like I was trying not to wake someone up. The cold air hit me fully when they moved me out of the car, and I turned my head to look at the vehicle for the first time. The driver's side was compressed inward at an angle that made me understand very clearly that I had been fortunate. Fortunate was a strange word to apply to that particular moment, but it was the correct one. The truck had struck the rear quarter panel rather than the door itself. 6 inches forward, and we would not have been having any conversation at all. At the hospital, New York Presbyterian, Queens, a 12-minute drive that felt considerably longer from the inside of an ambulance, the examination moved with a momentum that left no room for questions. CT scan of my head, X-rays of my wrist and chest. A nurse named Sandra, who checked my pupils with a small light and asked me to squeeze her fingers and tell her what month it was. "November," I said, 2024. "I know where I am. I need to know if someone called my neighbor." "Your neighbor was contacted," Sandra said. "She's with your wife. Everything is being handled." She said it the way good nurses say things, not dismissively, but with a firmness that was meant to free me from the problem, so I could focus on the immediate one. "Right now, I need you to focus on you, Mr. Calloway. Can you do that?" I told her I could. I was not entirely certain it was true. The doctor came in 40 minutes later. He was a compact man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the unhurried manner of someone who had delivered difficult news enough times to know that rushing it did not help anyone. "Mr. Calloway," he said, pulling a stool close to the bed, "you have a mild concussion, 2 cracked ribs on the left side, and a fracture in your left wrist, the distal radius, which is the most common wrist fracture we see. None of these are life-threatening. All of them require time and rest." He paused. "We'd like to keep you overnight for observation given the head injury. With concussions, the first 24 hours matter." I stared at him. "I can't stay overnight. I understand that's not what you were hoping to hear. My wife has Parkinson's disease. She's at home with a neighbor who has her own responsibilities." I pushed myself up against the pillow, and the cracked ribs immediately registered their objection, sharp and insistent. I need to make some phone calls. The doctor nodded slowly. Make your calls, Mr. Calloway. But I want you to understand that discharging yourself tonight with a concussion and those injuries would be a serious risk. He stood. I'll give you some time. I reached for my phone with my right hand. The screen had a crack across the lower corner, but it still worked. I pulled up my contacts and scrolled to the name I had listed years ago under the category of people who would come when I called. I found Brandon's name. My thumb hovered over it for just a moment. Then I pressed call. Brandon answered on the fourth ring. I know it was the fourth because I counted them the way I count everything automatically without deciding to. 1, 2, 3. The pause before the fourth felt long enough that I had already begun composing the voicemail in my head, already deciding which words would make him understand, without making him defensive, which was always the particular engineering problem of talking to my son. Then he picked up. Dad. Not a question, not concern, just an acknowledgement that the call had connected and he was choosing to participate in it. Brandon. I kept my voice level. The cracked ribs made deep breaths impossible, so I had been speaking in shorter sentences all evening, which turned out to be useful. I've been in an accident. I'm at New York Presbyterian, Queens. I have a concussion, 2 cracked ribs, and a fracture in my wrist. They're keeping me overnight. A pause. In the background, I could hear noise, the particular dense hum of a crowded space, voices, overlapping something that might have been a PA announcement. I did not understand what I was hearing yet. Are you serious? Brandon said. I wouldn't call you from a hospital bed to tell you something that wasn't true. Okay. I heard him exhale. Okay, are the injuries bad? They're keeping me overnight for observation. The wrist will need follow-up. I shifted against the pillow, and the ribs reminded me sharply to stop doing that. Brandon, I need someone with your mother tonight. Carol has been with her since I left for the pharmacy, but she can't stay past morning. She has work. I need you or Diane to go to the house. The background noise shifted. I heard what I thought was a rolling suitcase. The sound of a floor announcement, distant but distinct. Where are you right now? I asked. What is that sound? A beat of silence. Then, we're at the airport, Dad. I pressed my palm flat against the mattress. What airport? JFK. He said it the way people say things they have been rehearsing. We've been planning this trip for 8 months. Diane and I were taking the kids to Cabo for 10 days. We leave in about 40 minutes. I looked at the ceiling of my hospital room. There was a water stain in the upper left corner shaped vaguely like the state of Michigan. I stared at it because it gave me something neutral to focus on while I processed what my son had just said. Brandon, I said carefully, I am in the hospital. Your mother is home alone with a neighbor who cannot stay indefinitely. I am not asking you to cancel the trip. I am asking you to go to the house tonight. Stay with your mother and give me 24 hours to arrange something more permanent. Dad, we have tickets. The kids have been looking forward to this since March. I understand that. I did not raise my voice. Raising my voice had never worked with Brandon, and it was not going to start working tonight. I am asking you to delay one flight. Take a later one tomorrow. One day, Brandon. That's what I'm asking for. It's not that simple. The resort has a check-in window, and if we miss the first night, we lose the deposit on the room upgrade. We're talking about real money here. I thought about the $4,900 that left my account on the 15th of every month. I thought about the word deposit. I thought about the word upgrade. I did not say any of those things. Put Diane on, I said. Diane's dealing with the kids at the gate. Dad, listen, Mom isn't going to fall apart overnight. Carol's there. You can call the doctor in the morning and arrange a home health aide or whatever you need. You're good at organizing things. You've always been good at that." There it was. The specific compliment that was also a dismissal. You're good at organizing things. The implication being that my competence in a crisis was the reason my crisis did not require his presence. Your mother has stage 3 Parkinson's disease, I said. She cannot manage her evening medication without assistance. She cannot get up in the night safely without someone in the house. Carol has agreed to stay until morning, and morning is not a long-term solution. I hear you, Dad. I really do. He did not sound like he heard me. He sounded like a man standing in an airport terminal, watching the gate number on the departures board, calculating how much longer he could stay on the phone. Call the agency you used last time. They can send someone tonight, can't they? Brandon, Dad. I'm sorry. I genuinely am. But we've been planning this for 8 months, and the kids— I know, I said. You've been planning it for 8 months. He stopped talking. Perhaps he heard something in my voice. I am not certain what it was because I had worked very hard in that moment to keep my voice exactly the same as it had been 30 seconds earlier. Call me when you land, I said. Let me know when you arrive safely. Dad, come on, don't be like that. I'm not being like anything, Brandon. I'm telling you to call when you land. Travel safe. I ended the call. My thumb stayed on the darkened screen for a long moment. The room was quiet except for the soft, mechanical rhythm of something beeping down the hall and the distant sound of an elevator opening and closing. My wrist throbbed inside its temporary splint. My ribs ached with each breath I took, which meant they ached constantly. I had been a father for 41 years. I had coached Little League in the rain and sat through school plays where Brandon forgot his lines and driven him to the emergency room twice before he was 12 years old, once for a broken collarbone and once for a fishhook in his thumb that he swore was not his fault. I had co-signed his first apartment lease and lent him money 3 separate times before the monthly transfers began, and I had done all of it because that is what fathers do. You show up even when it is inconvenient, even when you are tired, even when you had other plans. He had said 7 words before the conversation ended. Mom's not going to fall apart overnight. I sat with those 7 words for a long time. Then I found Diane's name in my contacts and pressed call. Diane picked up on the 3rd ring. I could hear music before she said a word, something with a heavy bass line, the kind that comes out of resort speakers at happy hour, and the sound of it hit me somewhere in the chest that had nothing to do with my cracked ribs. Dad. Her voice carried the particular brightness of someone who had already had 2 drinks and was deciding whether to be annoyed at the interruption. What's going on? Brandon texted me. Then you know I'm in the hospital. He said you were in an accident. Are you okay? 2 cracked ribs, a fractured wrist, a concussion. They're keeping me overnight. I kept my sentences short. The ribs again. Diane, I need you to go to the house. Your mother needs someone there tonight. Carol can stay until morning, but she has a shift at the clinic tomorrow. A pause. The music in the background dipped slightly as though she had stepped away from it. Dad, I'm literally at the gate. We board in 20 minutes. I know, Brandon told me. I looked at the water stain on the ceiling again, still shaped like Michigan, still entirely unhelpful. I'm not asking you to cancel. I'm asking you to take a later flight, tomorrow morning. Give me 1 night to arrange professional care for your mother. We have the kids with us. Dylan's already asleep on Marcus's lap. If we delay now, we lose the whole first day at the resort, and the kids have been— Diane. I said her name the way I used to when she was 16, and explaining why a broken curfew was actually someone else's fault. Your mother has Parkinson's. She cannot be alone overnight. That is not a scheduling inconvenience. That is a medical reality. Her voice shifted, not softer, tighter. Dad, I understand that. But Carol is there. You said so yourself. Can't she just stay one more night? We can Venmo her, pay her for her time. Carol, who brought us soup. Carol, who had driven Maggie to her neurologist appointment in September when I had a conflict, and never once mentioned it afterward. Carol is not a paid caregiver, I said. She is our neighbor. She has already done more than anyone could ask. Then call an agency. You can do that from the hospital, right? You're organized, Dad. You know how to handle things like this. There it was again, the same compliment Brandon had used, almost the same words as though they had rehearsed it together in the terminal. We'll check in when we land. I promise. Diane. Dad. I love you, but I have to go. They're calling our zone. A rustling sound. The music surged briefly. Call the agency. We'll talk when we get to Cabo. The line went dead. I set the phone face down on the mattress beside me. My wrist throbbed. My ribs ached. The room smelled like antiseptic and recycled air, and somewhere down the corridor, a television was playing a game show at a volume designed for someone who could not hear well. I pressed the back of my right hand over my eyes for a moment, not crying, not even close to it, just needing a second of darkness to think. Then I picked the phone back up and called Carol. She answered immediately. Ray, how are you? How bad is it? Manageable. I cleared my throat. Carol, I'm so sorry to do this. Brandon and Diane are both there traveling. They can't come tonight. A pause, short and precise. Okay, she said in the tone of someone who had already figured out where the conversation was going and had decided not to make it harder than it needed to be. I can stay tonight. Don't apologize. What does Maggie need before bed? I walked her through it, the evening medication, the order of the pills, the glass of water Maggie preferred at room temperature, the way the left side of the bed needed the rail up after 10 o'clock. Carol listened without interrupting and asked 2 clarifying questions, both of them practical. When I finished, she said, I've got it. You focus on getting your head looked at. Carol. Ray, I've got her. Go. After I hung up, I found the number for a private home health agency I had researched 6 months ago and never called because I had told myself we were not at that point yet. It turned out we were at that point. We had probably been at that point for longer than I wanted to admit. The intake coordinator, a calm, efficient woman, who did not make me feel foolish for calling at 7:45 on a weeknight, confirmed they could have a certified home health aide at our address by 8 the following morning. I gave her Maggie's diagnosis, her medication schedule, the door code, and my credit card number. She read everything back to me correctly. I thanked her and meant it. I had just set the phone down when the door opened. Arthur Bloom was 71 years old and had been my closest friend for 22 years. We had met at an accounting conference in 1999 and discovered within 40 minutes that we had almost identical opinions about depreciation schedules and almost no opinions in common about anything else, which had somehow formed the foundation of a friendship that had outlasted 2 of his career changes, 1 of my knee surgeries, and more New York Mets seasons than either of us liked to remember. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee from the vending machine down the hall, and he held one out to me with the matter-of-fact air of a man who had not considered the possibility that I might not want it. The nurse told me you weren't supposed to have caffeine with a concussion, he said, settling into the chair beside the bed. So I got you decaf, which tastes like hot water that's heard rumors about coffee, but it's warm. He looked at me steadily, taking in the splint on my wrist, the way I was holding my ribs with each breath. Brandon and Diane, on their way to Cabo, on their way to Tow. Arthur looked at me for a long moment. His expression did not change, which was one of the things I valued most about him. He did not perform reactions. He had opinions, strong ones, but he did not make you watch him have them. "Drink the coffee," he said. "It's terrible, but it's something to do with your hands." I took the cup. It was as advertised terrible. But it was warm, and Arthur was there, and the agency was sending someone in the morning, and Carol was with Maggie, and for a few minutes that had to be enough. What I did not know, I said quietly, more to the room than to Arthur, was that the night was not finished with me yet. Arthur nodded once as though that was the most reasonable thing he had heard all evening. Then he settled back in his chair, and we sat together in the bad lighting of a hospital room in Queens, two old men with nowhere else to be. Before I reveal the jaw-dropping truth inside this ledger, comment numbers below so I know you are still with me. And please note, the upcoming chapters contain fictional details added for dramatic effect. If this isn't for you, feel free to turn off the video right now. It was past 11 when I heard footsteps stop outside my door. They were not the quick, rubber-soled shuffle of a night nurse making rounds. They were slow, deliberate steps, the kind that belong to someone who has decided exactly where they are going and sees no reason to hurry about it. Arthur was asleep in the chair beside me, his chin dropped toward his chest. The terrible decaf coffee balanced loosely in his hand at an angle that defied physics. I watched the door. It opened. The woman who walked in was 82 years old, and she looked like someone who had always found that fact mildly irrelevant. She wore a charcoal wool coat buttoned to the collar, despite the warmth of the hospital corridor, and her silver hair was pinned back with the precise neatness of someone who had been maintaining that particular style for 40 years and found it satisfactory. She carried a large leather bag over one arm, and under the other, pressed against her side with the careful grip of someone transporting something that mattered, was a book. A ledger bound in dark red cloth, its corners worn smooth. She looked at Arthur first, then at me. Her eyes were sharp and unhurried, moving from the splint on my wrist to the careful way I was holding my ribs, cataloging the information, the way experienced people catalog things quickly, without commentary. "Raymond," she said. Not a question, a confirmation. "Eleanor." I had not spoken her name in years, but it came back to me without effort the way important things do. "How did you know I was here?" Arthur called me. She set her bag on the floor beside the second chair, the one that was not occupied by a sleeping man, and sat down with the unhurried ease of someone who had long since stopped performing energy she did not have. "He called me from the parking garage before he came up. He thought I should know." I looked at Arthur, still asleep, coffee still miraculously level. 22 years of friendship, and he had never once mentioned that he and Eleanor Whitfield were in contact. I filed that away. "Eleanor Whitfield," I said more to myself than to her. "I haven't seen you since the Garrison retirement dinner. That was 2019. 2018, she said. October. You wore a blue tie. You remember the tie. I remember everything, Raymond. It is one of the genuine advantages of age that people consistently underestimate." She rested both hands on the ledger in her lap, not opening it, just resting them there, the way you rest your hands on something you have been carrying for a long time. "I need to ask you something before we go any further. I need to know what Brandon told you your monthly payments were covering." The question landed with a weight I had not expected. I looked at her carefully. Eleanor Whitfield had spent 40 years as an estate attorney in Manhattan, which meant she had spent 40 years sitting across from people in the worst moments of their financial lives and asking them questions they did not want to answer. She had retired 6 years ago, and from everything I knew, she had spent the time since doing exactly as she pleased. "How much do you know?" I asked. Enough to come here at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. She held my gaze. Tell me what he said. I told her. All of it, the first phone call 2 years ago, my father presenting the numbers, the way I had once presented quarterly reports. The mortgage they claimed was consuming their income. The medical coverage that allegedly left them short every month. The utilities, the accumulating expenses that added up, according to Brandon, to exactly $4,900 a month. I told her about the conversations that followed, the way he made verification sound like an insult, the automatic transfer I had set up, and never questioned, because questioning it had felt like a failure of loyalty. Eleanor listened without interrupting. Her expression did not change into sympathy or outrage or any of the things people's faces usually do when they hear something difficult. She listened the way a judge listens fully, without signaling a verdict. When I finished, she was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. I counted. Raymond, she said, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it as information rather than as an attack on people you love. Can you do that? My ribs ached. My wrist throbbed. Somewhere down the hall, a call light was buzzing with the patient persistence of something that had been buzzing for a while. Arthur stirred slightly in his chair, shifted, and settled back into sleep without waking. Tell me, I said. Eleanor opened the ledger. The pages were filled with her handwriting. Precise, small, consistent. The handwriting of someone trained in an era when penmanship was considered a professional skill. Dates ran down the left margin. Figures filled the columns to the right. Small, adhesive tabs marked sections throughout color-coded in a system I did not yet understand. I came to know about your transfers because Brandon came to see me, she said. 2 years ago. He told me he was concerned about your estate planning. He asked questions about trusts, about powers of attorney, about what happens to jointly held assets when one spouse becomes incapacitated. She turned to the first tabbed section and smoothed the page flat with her palm. The questions themselves were not unusual. What was unusual was how he asked them. He was not asking how to protect you. He was asking how to access what you had. The buzzing down the hall stopped. The room felt very quiet. I did not have enough to bring to you at that time, Eleanor continued. What I had was a concern and a set of questions that did not yet have answers. She looked up from the ledger and met my eyes directly. I should have found a way to reach you sooner, Raymond. I want to say that plainly. I told myself it was not my place. I was wrong about that. I appreciated that she did not dress the admission up. She said it the way she said everything, precisely without ornamentation, and then she moved forward. Look at this, she said, and turned the ledger toward me. The first column was dates. The second was deposit amounts. Each deposit amount matched to the dollar the automatic transfers I had been sending for 22 months. Beside each deposit was a corresponding outflow, sometimes within days, sometimes within hours, to accounts I did not recognize. I leaned forward, ignoring the protest from my ribs, and looked more closely. The numbers did not lie. They never did. That was the thing about numbers that I had understood since I was 23 years old and sitting in my first audit, learning that figures did not have motivations or loyalties or reasons to spare anyone's feelings. Where did it go? I asked, though some part of me, the part that had been keeping records for 40 years, had already begun to understand. Eleanor turned to the next tabbed section. That, oh, she said quietly, is what I came here to show you. The first page covered 22 months. I recognized the deposit dates before I recognized anything else about the ledger. They were burned into my memory, the way all recurring financial commitments are burned into an accountant's memory. The 15th of every month, $4,900 gone from my account under the label I had chosen myself. Family support. I had typed those words into the transfer description field on a Tuesday morning 2 years ago, and had not questioned them since because questioning them would have required me to question everything that came before them. And I had not been ready to do that. I was ready now. I did not have a choice about being ready now. "Walk me through it," I said. My voice was steady. I was grateful for that. Eleanor turned the ledger so it faced me fully and moved her chair closer so we could look at it together. She did not reach across and point at things or explain before I had a chance to see. She simply waited the way people wait when they understand that the person beside them is capable of reading what is in front of them and only needs time to do it. The deposits were on the left. Each one matched my transfers exactly the date, the amount, the 22-month pattern I had maintained without interruption. Beside each deposit, highlighted in pale yellow, were the outgoing transactions that followed within days, sometimes within hours. I followed them with my right index finger, the one attached to the hand that was not in a splint, moving down the column slowly. A payment to a property management company in Midtown Manhattan. Monthly consistent, the kind of payment that looks like rent. Brandon's rent I understood in the apartment he had told me he was struggling to afford. A series of charges to a credit account bearing Brandon's name, retail restaurants. A car service used repeatedly between Manhattan and the Hamptons on weekends. Transfers to Diane's account, in amounts that varied, but averaged when I added them in my head, without being asked, to approximately $900 a month. Charges connected to what the notation beside them described as BD Consulting Venture, a business name I had never heard, associated with expenditures that showed no corresponding revenue. I turned to the next page. The pattern continued without variation. "The mortgage," I said. "There is no mortgage," Eleanor said. "Your son owns that apartment outright. He purchased it 4 years ago. The deed is in his name alone." I set my right hand flat on the page. The paper was cool under my palm. He told me he was 3 months behind. He told me they were threatening to involve a collections agency. "I know what he told you." Eleanor's voice did not carry judgment. It carried something harder to absorb, simple confirmation. It was not true. I turned to the section she had tabbed in orange. The heading in Eleanor's precise handwriting read, "Medical B. Calloway claim 18 months prior." Beneath it was a copy of a bank transfer, $18,000, from my personal savings account to Brandon's, dated on a Thursday. I remembered clearly because I had moved the money the morning after he called me, unable to sleep, too frightened for my son to wait until business hours. He had called me at 9:45 in the evening. He had been crying. He had said the word malignant, and I had stopped hearing anything else for several seconds. Beside the transfer, Eleanor had written 4 words in red ink. No corresponding medical records. "He told me it was thyroid cancer," I said. "Early stage. He said the surgery was scheduled for the following month." Tommy sent Brandon a formal written request through legal channels requiring him to produce medical records supporting his claim, Eleanor said. Brandon's attorney responded with a 30-day delay, then another. When Tommy filed a subpoena request, Brandon's attorney withdrew. "There is no surgical record, no oncology consultation, no diagnosis that has ever been produced." Quentin, she paused. "In New York State, what Brandon did, obtaining money through a false representation of illness, constitutes theft by deception under the Penal Law Section 155. It is a felony, Raymond, depending on the amount involved. $18,000 places it well above the felony threshold. I had prosecuted exactly 0 criminal cases in my career. I had spent 30 years with numbers, not courtrooms. But I understood thresholds. I understood the difference between a misdemeanor and a felony the way I understood the difference between a rounding error and fraud. One was a mistake and one was a choice. Brandon had made a choice. I turned to the next tabbed section. The heading read, Power of Attorney Scope and Usage. This, Eleanor said, is where it becomes more serious. She placed a document beside the ledger, a copy of the power of attorney I had signed at the kitchen table 18 months ago on an evening when Maggie had just come through a difficult episode, and Brandon had appeared at the door with the paperwork already printed, already organized, already waiting for my signature. Dad, the hospital needs this on file. It's just for medical decisions. Sign here and here. I had signed without reading it fully. I, Raymond Calloway, who had spent 3 decades telling clients to read every line of every document before putting a pen to it, had signed a power of attorney for my son on a Tuesday evening because my wife was frightened and I was frightened, and Brandon had seemed so calm and so prepared, and I had been grateful for calm and prepared. Eleanor turned the document to the relevant section and set her finger beneath a paragraph I had not read. I read it now. The authority granted was not limited to medical decisions. It extended in language I recognized as deliberately broad to the management of jointly held financial accounts during periods of the grantor's incapacity or absence. Maggie's medical savings account was jointly held. I had been in the hospital for less than 12 hours. Technically, that constituted an absence. He used it, I said. It was not a question. Over 14 months, Eleanor said. Incrementally. Never enough in a single withdrawal to trigger the bank's automatic fraud alert. $67,000 in total. The number sat between us on the ledger page like something that had been waiting a long time to be seen. $67,000. From the account I had built over 11 years specifically to ensure that Maggie would have what she needed for the rest of her life. The account I checked every quarter and never touched, because touching it had felt like admitting something I was not willing to admit. I did not speak for a long moment. Arthur was still asleep in his chair. His breathing was slow and even. The coffee had finally tilted past the point of balance and had left a pale stain on his sleeve, and he had not woken up. There is one more thing, Eleanor said. Her voice had not changed its register throughout the entire conversation, steady, precise, without inflection, that might tell me how to feel about what I was hearing. Something about the house on Long Island. I looked up from the ledger. My parents' house, I said. Yes, Eleanor said. Your parents' house. I had not been to the house in Merrick since the previous October. 14 months. I had told myself it was because Maggie needed me close, which was true. I had told myself the drive was too long on top of everything else I was managing, which was also true. What I had not told myself, because I had gotten very good at not telling myself certain things, was that walking into that house alone felt like something I was not yet capable of doing without cost. My father had built it in 1971, the year before I was born. He had poured the back porch himself over a single weekend in July with 2 neighbors and a bag of concrete mix, and a level he still talked about 30 years later, as though it were a piece of precision engineering. My mother had planted the hydrangeas along the left side of the property in 1978, and they had come back every summer since without being asked. When my parents died, my father in 2009, my mother, 14 months later, as though she had simply decided she was finished once he was gone, I had inherited the house and everything in it, including the level which I kept on the shelf in the garage, because throwing it away had felt wrong. Brandon had a spare key. He had asked for one 6 years ago, saying he liked to check on the property when he was out that way, visiting friends. I had given it to him without a second thought, because that is what you do. You give your son a key to your parents' house because he is your son, and the house is part of the family, and trust is supposed to be the default, not something you have to earn through documentation. Tell me about the house, I said. Eleanor reached into her leather bag and produced a printed document, several pages stapled. She set it on top of the ledger. The header read, Airbnb host activity property address 44 Clearwater Lane, Merrick, NY. I looked at the listing dates. The first entry was dated 10 months ago. A neighbor contacted me, Eleanor said. Margaret Hoffman, she lives 2 doors down from your property and has known your family for 30 years. She saw unfamiliar cars in the driveway on weekends. She assumed you had started renting the house and was not troubled by it, only curious. When she heard through mutual acquaintances that you had been in an accident, she called me to ask how you were doing. Eleanor paused. In the course of that conversation, she mentioned the guests. I turned to the second page, booking records printed from a screenshot. Dates, nightly rates, guest names, I did not recognize. The property was listed under a host account, with a display name I did not recognize either are. Callaway Rentals using my name without my knowledge or permission. He used my name, I said. He used your name and your address and photographs of the interior that he must have taken during visits when the house was unoccupied. Eleanor's voice remained even. The listing described the property as a, quote, family vacation home available for short-term rental, unquote. He priced it at $220 per night on weekdays and $310 on weekends. I did the arithmetic in my head before she gave me the total, because I could not stop myself from doing arithmetic any more than I could stop breathing. 10 months of weekend bookings at average occupancy. The number I arrived at was not precise, but it was in the range. $32,000, Eleanor said. Approximately, based on the booking records Margaret was able to access before the listing was taken down. $32,000. Generated from a house my mother had lived in for 38 years. Generated from the property where my father's concrete porch still stood, where the hydrangeas came back every summer, where I had not been able to make myself go alone because it hurt too much. Brandon had turned it into a revenue stream. He had not asked. He had not mentioned it. He had used my name, unlocked the door with the key I had given him in good faith, photographed the rooms where my parents had slept and eaten and lived, and listed those rooms on the internet for strangers to rent, while collecting the money directly into his own account. In New York State, renting another person's property without their authorization constitutes unauthorized use of property and can be charged as theft by deception. Beyond that, income from short-term rentals is taxable. Brandon had reported none of it. Eleanor explained this in the same steady tone she had used to explain everything else, the way a physician explains a diagnosis, not to cause additional pain, but because withholding the information would cause more. He would have received a Form 1099 from the platform if the income exceeded $600, I said. The tax professional in me surfaced automatically, reaching for the familiar framework of regulations, which it clearly did. He did not file amended returns, Eleanor confirmed, which compounds the exposure considerably. But I set the document down on top of the ledger and looked at my right hand resting on the pages. 67 years old, and I could still read a financial statement faster than most people could read a newspaper. I had built a career on understanding where money went, and why and what the movement of it revealed about the people moving it. I had taught my children when they were young that numbers told stories, that you could understand almost anything about a person by looking honestly at how they handled money, what they prioritized, what they concealed, what they believed they were entitled to take. Brandon had learned the lesson. He had simply learned the wrong half of it. I picked up my phone. The screen showed 1:41 in the morning. Arthur was still asleep. Eleanor sat beside me without moving, without speaking, giving me the room I needed. I opened the banking application. My wrist made the navigation awkward. I had to use my right thumb instead of my usual hand, but I found the recurring transfer section without difficulty. 22 scheduled transfers completed. The 23rd was set for the 15th of next month. Family support, $4,900, recurring monthly. I looked at those words for a moment. I had typed them myself. I had meant them at the time in the way people mean things before they understand what the thing actually is. I pressed cancel. A confirmation screen appeared asking me to verify the cancellation of the recurring payment. I read it once. The language was straightforward. The transfer would not process on the scheduled date, and all future transfers in the series would be permanently stopped. I pressed confirm. The screen returned to the account summary. The scheduled transfer was gone. In its place was simply the balance, the same number it had always been, no longer with a pending deduction attached to it. Nothing changed in the room. Arthur did not wake up. The hospital corridor outside continued its quiet, nighttime rhythm. Eleanor did not say anything, and I was grateful for that, because there was nothing to say that the numbers had not already said more clearly. I set the phone face down on the mattress and looked at the ceiling. "Don't be long, Ray." "There is something else you should know," Eleanor said. Her voice was quieter than it had been. Not soft or quieter the way a room gets quiet when something important is about to occupy it. Something about what Brandon and Diane believe is waiting for them. I turned my head toward her. "Tell me," I said. Eleanor reached into her leather bag one final time. What she produced was not another document from the ledger system, not another printed bank statement or booking record. It was a single folded page, cream-colored, heavier stock than ordinary paper, the kind used by attorneys' offices for correspondence that is meant to last. She unfolded it with the deliberate care of someone handling something that has already been through more than one difficult conversation, and she set it on the rolling table between us. "3 years ago," she said, "you and Maggie came to my office on a Thursday afternoon in September. You brought coffee from the place on Lexington that has been there since 1987 and is still somehow the best cup in Midtown. Maggie had a good day that day. She remembered the name of my assistant and asked about her daughter's college applications. I remembered the day. I remembered it clearly because good days had already begun to feel like gifts rather than defaults. You asked me to help you restructure your estate," Eleanor continued. "You said you had been thinking about it for some time and that recent events had clarified your thinking. We worked for 2 months on the documents. Tommy Reyes handled the legal filing. Everything was signed, witnessed by 2 independent parties, and notarized in October of that year." She set her finger on the page. "Brandon and Diane have never been informed of this revision." I looked at the document. It was a summary page, the kind Tommy prepared for client records, condensing the essential provisions into plain language. I had a copy in my own files at home in the fireproof box in the closet of the study behind the hanging files labeled Insurance and Deeds. "They think the 2015 will is still operative," I said. "They do." Brandon asked me about it obliquely during the same conversation, where he inquired about the power of attorney. He referenced the division of assets in terms that suggested he had read it. Eleanor folded her hands in her lap. "He was planning around a document that no longer exists. The trust fund established in October 3 years ago directed the entirety of my estate, both properties, the retirement accounts, the savings, into a revocable living trust administered by Tommy Reyes. The purpose was specific and documented to fund Maggie's medical care for the remainder of her life, with any remainder directed to the Parkinson's Foundation Research Fund in Eleanor's name. Brandon and Diane were not named as beneficiaries. They had not been named because I had sat in Eleanor's office on a Thursday afternoon and thought carefully about what I knew and what I valued and what I wanted my life's work to accomplish when I was no longer here to direct it myself. And the answer had not included financing the continuation of what I had already been financing without my knowledge. I had not told them because there had seemed to be no reason to tell them yet. A will is not a conversation. It is a record of decisions already made. "All right," I said. Arthur woke up at 3:57. He woke the way he always did, completely, without the gradual surfacing that most people went through. One moment asleep, the next entirely present. He looked at the coffee stain on his sleeve, then at Eleanor, then at me, and made the rapid assessment of someone who had been a professional numbers man for 40 years and could read a room the way other people read text. "How bad?" he said. "Considerable," I said. He nodded and reached for his phone. I assumed he was checking the time. Instead, he frowned at the screen, tapped something, and held it out toward me without a word. It was a web page. The header read, "Help Ray Calloway recover a family in crisis." Below the header was a photograph. It was me. In this room. In this bed. Taken from the doorway at an angle that suggested the photographer had not wanted to come too close or had not wanted to be seen. The splint on my wrist was visible. The bruising along my left temple was visible. I was looking toward the window, unaware that anyone was taking a picture. The caption beneath the photograph read, "Our dad was in a serious accident and is fighting to recover. He has no one to help him right now. Any support means the world to our family." The campaign had been created by an account registered to Diane Calloway Hurst. The fundraising goal was $30,000. The current total, according to the counter at the top of the page, was $23,460. The campaign had been live for 11 hours. I read the donor list. There were 142 entries. I recognized names, colleagues from the firm where I had spent 30 years, neighbors from Fresh Meadows, people who had known me and Maggie for decades, and had seen the campaign and opened their wallets without hesitation, because the person asking was my daughter, and the person in the photograph was me. And there was no reason from the outside to doubt that the need was real. Arthur had donated $500. He was looking at me steadily, with the expression he used when he had already decided what he thought, and was giving me the space to arrive at my own conclusion first. "She took that photograph before she left for the airport," I said. The understanding assembled itself with the mechanical clarity of a calculation, completing each piece moving into its assigned position until the final figure was visible. "She came to the hospital. She stood in my doorway while I was looking out the window. She took the picture and she left." "Ray," Arthur said. His voice carried the particular weight of someone who wants to say more and has decided that saying less is the greater kindness. The number sat in the room with us. Diane was currently sitting in a resort in Cabo San Lucas, having photographed her unconscious father in a hospital bed, and used the image to solicit donations from his friends and colleagues while flying to Mexico. The money was going into her account. There was no recovery fund. There was no family crisis management. There was a woman on a beach with a fundraising page bearing my face. Under federal law, using electronic communications to obtain money through fraudulent misrepresentation, which is precisely what a GoFundMe campaign built on false pretenses constitutes, is wire fraud under Title 18 of the United States Code Section 1343. It carries a penalty of up to 20 years. I wrote the message to Brandon and Diane at 4 o'clock exactly. I kept it short because short was what I was capable of at 4 in the morning, with cracked ribs and a fractured wrist, and $23,460 worth of clarity sitting on Arthur's phone screen. I told them Maggie had professional care arranged. I told them the monthly transfer had been permanently canceled. I told them the locks would be changed before they returned from Mexico. I told them Tommy Reyes would be in contact. I did not mention the GoFundMe. Not yet. Some things are better addressed when you are not in a hospital bed at 4 in the morning, when you can sit across a table from a person and watch them decide what kind of person they are going to be about what they have done. I pressed send. Then I set the phone face down on the mattress, and the three of us, Eleanor, Arthur, and I, sat together in the fluorescent quiet of a hospital room in Queens, while the city outside continued doing what New York City does at 4 in the morning, which is exactly what it does at every other hour, without apology and without pause. The doctor signed my discharge papers at 9:15. He went through the instructions with the thorough patience of someone who had learned probably through experience that patients in pain do not retain everything they are told, and that repetition was therefore not redundant but necessary. No driving for at least 2 weeks. Nothing heavier than a coffee cup in the left hand until the orthopedic follow-up confirmed the fracture was healing correctly. Sleep with the wrist elevated. Watch for increased headache, vision changes, or confusion. Any of those return immediately. The ribs would hurt for 4 to 6 weeks regardless of what I did, and the most useful thing I could do about that was breathe deliberately and not try to rush the process. I told him I understood. I meant it more genuinely than I had meant most things in the last 12 hours. Arthur had gone down to get the car, while the nurse removed my IV line and went over the discharge paperwork a second time. Eleanor had left at 6 after ensuring that I had Tommy's direct number saved in my phone and that I had eaten the crackers and apple juice a night nurse had brought at 5:30. She had not said goodbye so much as she had simply stood, put on her charcoal coat, picked up her leather bag and the red ledger, and walked toward the door with the unhurried certainty of a woman who had accomplished what she came to do. At the threshold, she had paused and turned back. "Raymond," she said, "what you did last night to transfer the message that was not cruelty. I want you to hear that clearly, because in the coming days, people will try to tell you otherwise." I had nodded. She had left. The morning outside the hospital was cold and very bright, the particular brightness of late November in New York, when the sky is completely clear and the light has no warmth in it, only clarity. Arthur pulled the car to the entrance and came around to open the passenger door, which I did not need but accepted, because the alternative was to stand in the cold, arguing about it with a 71-year-old man who had slept in a hospital chair all night on my behalf. "You don't have to come in, Wang," I said when we turned onto my street. "I know," Arthur said, which meant he was coming in. Carol opened the front door before we reached it. She looked at the splint on my wrist and the bruising on my temple with the appraising eye of a woman who had spent 22 years in an emergency room and knew exactly what she was looking at. And then she stepped back and let us in without making it into a production. That was one of the things I valued most about Carol. She understood that sometimes the most useful thing a person could do was make space. "She had a good night," Carol said. "2 small tremor episodes around 3, but they passed quickly. She took her morning medication about 40 minutes ago. She's in the living room." I walked through the kitchen past the cinnamon candle on the counter, burned down an inch since yesterday afternoon, past the medication schedule I had printed and laminated and taped to the cabinet door and into the living room. Maggie was sitting in her chair by the window. The morning light came through the glass at a low angle and lay across her hands, which were folded in her lap with the careful stillness she had developed over the last 2 years. The deliberate composure of someone who had made peace with the difference between the stillness she chose and the trembling she could not. She was wearing the blue cardigan I had given her for her birthday in March. She looked up when I came in. There is a particular way Maggie has looked at me for 43 years, a specific quality of attention that I have never been able to describe accurately to anyone, including her, because it is not something that translates into language. It is simply the way she looks at me. It was the first thing I fell in love with, before the humor and the stubbornness, and the way she argued about directions even when I was demonstrably correct. Just the way her eyes found me in a room and stayed. She looked at me that way now. Her gaze moved from my temple to my wrist and back to my face, and something in her expression tightened briefly, the small, involuntary flinch of someone who loves a person and dislikes seeing them hurt and then settled. "You look terrible," she said. My throat did something it had not done at any point during the previous 17 hours. I pressed my lips together hard and crossed the room and lowered myself carefully onto the arm of her chair, ribs registering their ongoing objection, and put my good arm around her shoulders. She leaned into me the way she always had, the way she had leaned into me during the difficult nights of the last 7 years, and for a moment neither of us said anything, and it was enough. "The kids," she said quietly against my shoulder. "In Mexico," I said. "They went ahead with the trip." Maggie was quiet for a beat. Then she made a small sound, not surprised, not hurt, exactly something more settled than either of those things, the sound of a person confirming something they had suspected for longer than they had let themselves acknowledge. "I see," she said. The home health aide arrived at 10:45. Her name was Patricia Osei, a compact, efficient woman in her late 40s, who introduced herself with the brisk professionalism of someone who understood that a new client did not need warmth so much as they needed competence, and that demonstrating competence was itself a form of reassurance. She reviewed Maggie's medication schedule without being prompted, asked 3 precise questions about the tremor episodes Carol had mentioned, and noted the answers in a small notebook she kept in her uniform pocket. Carol walked her through the house, the bathroom modifications, the grab bar installation. My son-in-law, Marcus, had done 2 years ago the emergency contact list on the refrigerator, and Patricia moved through the information with the focused attention of someone who intended to use it. I watched from the doorway and felt something in my chest loosen slightly, not heal, not resolve, but loosen the way a knot loosens when the right pressure is applied in the right direction. Arthur appeared beside me. He handed me a cup of coffee, real coffee this time, from the machine on the kitchen counter. "Better than the vending machine," I said. "Everything is better than the vending machine," he said. "That is the only thing the vending machine is genuinely useful for teaching." The locksmith arrived at 11:30. He worked quietly and efficiently, changing all 3 exterior locks in under 40 minutes. When he handed me the new keys, 2 sets standard brass, nothing remarkable about them, I held them for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Brandon and Diane had copies of the old key. Those copies now opened nothing. The house that had been accessible to them for years was no longer accessible to them, not because I had hidden it, or moved it, or taken it away in anger, but because access follows trust, and trust is not a permanent condition. It is something that has to be maintained the way you maintain anything that matters, steadily, honestly, with attention. I set 1 set of keys on the kitchen counter next to Maggie's medication schedule. The other set I put in my coat pocket where I could feel them. On the 3rd day after I came home, a photograph appeared in our family group chat. I had kept the notifications on because Maggie sometimes sent messages to the group, short ones, a few words, the kind she could manage on good mornings when her fingers cooperated, and I did not want to miss those. So when the phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, while I was reading the medication instructions Patricia had updated the previous afternoon, I picked it up without thinking. The photograph was of blue water and white sand. A resort pool in the foreground, the Pacific beyond it, the kind of saturated color that only exists in places designed specifically to be photographed. Brandon was in the frame, standing at the pool's edge in a linen shirt with a drink in his hand. He was laughing at something outside the shot. Behind him, 2 children, his and Marcus's, were jumping into the water, arms spread wide, entirely joyful, in the way children are joyful when they are in a place that has met every promise made about it. I set the phone down and finished reading the medication instructions. Arthur called that afternoon. He did not begin with pleasantries, which was one of the things I had always valued about him. He understood that there were moments when pleasantries were a form of delay rather than courtesy. "Diane posted a video," he said, "last night. It went Ray, it has 2 million views this morning. Tell me, she's sitting outside. You can see the ocean behind her. She's holding a drink." He paused. "She's crying, or doing something that resembles crying. The video is about 12 minutes long. The title is, Hold On." I heard him reading. "My father cut off his own family without warning. The truth our family has been afraid to say." I looked out the kitchen window at the backyard, where the hydrangeas Maggie had planted 8 years ago were bare and brown for winter. There was nothing interesting about the view. I found it useful anyway. "What does she say in it?" I asked. Arthur was quiet for a moment. "She says you have always used money to control the family. She says the monthly support was a form of manipulation, that you gave it, and then threatened to take it away whenever you wanted compliance. She says the accident was real, but that your response to it revealed who you actually are." Another pause. "She describes herself as the daughter of a man who believes love is transactional." The hydrangeas were very still in the cold air. Not a single branch moving. "Is the beach visible behind her?" I asked. "Yes." "And she's holding a drink while she says this?" "A large one," Arthur said, "with a paper umbrella." I almost said something that would have made Arthur laugh. I decided against it, not because it was not funny, it was in a way that existed several layers below where the pain was, but because laughing about it felt premature. There would be time for that later. That was one of the things I had learned in 68 years. Most things eventually become a story you can tell. The gap between the event and the story varies, but it closes. "I know," Arthur said. "Do not let that stand unaddressed." "What do you want to do?" "Nothing yet," I said. "Let me call Eleanor." Eleanor picked up on the second ring. I described the video in the terms Arthur had given me. She listened without comment until I finished, and then she said, "I've already seen it. And I have a call scheduled with someone I know at a crisis communications firm on 57th Street. Her voice was dry and measured. "However, you said something last week that I have been thinking about. You said you wanted the truth to catch up to the video on its own." I had said that. I remembered saying it. "I meant it," I said. "Then here is what I recommend," Eleanor said. "We do nothing public. Instead, Tommy begins the formal process, the power of attorney abuse filing with Adult Protective Services, the wire fraud referral for the GoFundMe, the unauthorized rental documentation for the Long Island property. These are not dramatic actions. They are administrative ones. They move through the system at the speed of the system." She paused. "But they move. And when they arrive as official record rather than as a family argument conducted online." It was, I thought, exactly the right approach. Not because it was faster, it would not be faster. Not because it was more satisfying in the immediate sense, it was not. But because it was the approach that treated what had happened as what it actually was, not a family dispute, but a series of documented offenses against a specific person, addressed through the mechanisms that exist precisely for that purpose. "Do it," I said. "Tell Tommy to start." "I already called him this morning," Eleanor said. "He's expecting to hear from you directly. Today, if possible." I called Tommy Reyes at 4 in the afternoon. He was 54 years old, had been practicing law in Manhattan for 26 years, and had the particular quality of good attorneys everywhere. He made complex things sound manageable without making them sound simple, which was an entirely different skill. "Ray," he said, "I've been going through everything Eleanor sent over. I want to be straightforward with you. What Brandon did with the power of attorney alone constitutes elder financial abuse, under New York Social Services Law, Section 473. That is a category that Adult Protective Services takes seriously and the District Attorney's Office takes more seriously. Add the GoFundMe and the Airbnb, and you are looking at multiple overlapping federal and state offenses. I understand, I said. The question I always ask a client in this situation, Tommy said, is what outcome they are actually trying to achieve. Because the legal system can deliver several different outcomes, and they are not all the same thing. I thought about Maggie in her chair by the window. I thought about $67,000 drawn from the account I had built to keep her safe. I thought about a photograph of my bruised face on a fundraising page generating money while its subject lay in a hospital bed unaware. I want documentation, I said. I want an official record of what happened. And I want Maggie protected financially completely without any vulnerability to what comes next. The trust already handles the third part, Tommy said. I'll file the APS report tomorrow morning and contact the U.S. Attorney's Office regarding the wire fraud. Ray, this will take time. Months, not days. Are you prepared for that? I spent 30 years doing annual audits, I said. I am familiar with processes that take longer than anyone finds comfortable. Tommy made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh, restrained into professionalism. I'll be in touch by end of week, he said. Take care of those ribs. I set the phone down and went to sit with Maggie, who was watching the evening news with the sound turned low and Patricia nearby doing something quiet in the corner of the room. The photograph from the family group chat was still on my phone. I had not responded to it. I did not intend to. Some pictures are worth exactly what they appear to be worth. Others are worth considerably more or considerably less than the image suggests. I had spent 30 years telling the difference. Tommy Reyes had been my attorney for 19 years, and in that time I had never seen him look the way he looked when I sat down across from his desk. It was not distress, exactly. Tommy was not a man who displayed distress. He was 54 years old and had spent 26 years practicing law in Manhattan, which meant he had sat across from people in the worst moments of their financial and personal lives. Often enough that his face had developed a professional neutrality that was not coldness, but something more useful. What I saw on his face that morning was something closer to the expression a structural engineer wears when he has finished inspecting a building, and the inspection has confirmed what he suspected, but hoped was wrong. His office was on the 31st floor of a building on Park Avenue South, with windows that looked north toward Midtown. On clear days, you could see the upper floors of the Empire State Building from the chair where I was sitting. It was a clear day. I had been in this chair many times for estate planning, for a contract dispute in 2014, for the trust documentation 3 years ago, and the view had always been the same. Today, it felt different. Today, I was not here to plan. I was here to understand the full shape of what had been done. Eleanor was already seated when I arrived. She had the red ledger on the table beside her chair, and a second folder I had not seen before, thicker tabbed in multiple colors, the kind of organization that meant someone had been working on this for longer than a single night. Tommy stood when I came in, shook my hand with the careful attention of someone mindful of the splint on my left wrist, and waited until I had settled before he sat back down. He opened the folder on his desk and looked at me directly. "Ray," he said, "I want to go through this methodically. Every item. I need you to stop me if anything is incorrect because accuracy matters at every stage of what comes next." "Go ahead," I said. He began with the power of attorney, the document I had signed at the kitchen table on the evening Maggie had come through a difficult episode while Brandon stood beside me with the papers already organized and a pen already uncapped, had contained language that extended well beyond medical authorization. Tommy turned his copy toward me and set his finger beneath the relevant paragraph, which I had already read in Eleanor's ledger, but which looked different now in the context of a law office printed on the kind of paper that courts accept as evidence. The granted authority included management of jointly held financial accounts during periods of the grantor's incapacity or absence. Brandon had used that language Tommy explained to access Maggie's medical savings account during 14 separate months. He had made withdrawals that were each carefully sized to remain below the threshold that would trigger the bank's automatic fraud detection, never more than $5,000 in a single transaction, always spaced far enough apart to appear routine. The aggregate, Tommy said, is $67,000 and change, over 14 months. He set down the document. Under New York Social Services Law Section 473, this is elder financial abuse. It is not a civil matter. It is a criminal matter, and it is one that Adult Protective Services and the District Attorney's Office both have jurisdiction over. I filed the APS report Monday morning. They have already opened a case. The words "opened a case" landed with a weight I had been preparing for, and still felt more heavily than I expected. The GoFundMe, I said. Tommy moved to the next tabbed section. The wire fraud referral had gone to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York the previous Friday. The campaign had raised $23,460, using a fraudulent premise my photograph taken without my knowledge or consent, used to solicit donations that went directly into Diane's personal account. Under Title 18 of the United States Code Section, 1343 wire fraud carried a federal penalty of up to 20 years per count. Diane's attorney contacted my office yesterday, Tommy said. She is aware that a referral has been made. What did her attorney say? That his client maintains the campaign was a good faith effort to support the family during a crisis. Tommy's expression did not change. I responded that good faith is a factual question, that the U.S. Attorney will evaluate using the evidence, including the booking records, showing she was on a resort property in Mexico when the campaign was created and when the funds were received. I looked out the window at the Empire State Building solid and gray against the December sky. The Long Island property, I said. Tommy nodded. The unauthorized rental documentation is the most straightforward piece legally. Brandon used your name, your address, and photographs of your property to generate income he deposited into his own account without your knowledge or permission. That is theft by deception under New York penal law, and it is also because he failed to report the income a matter for the IRS. I have prepared a referral to the Criminal Investigation Division. He paused and looked at me steadily. Ray, the last item. I knew what the last item was. The cancer, I said. Tommy opened the final section of the folder. The documentation was clean and complete bank records showing the $18,000 transfer from my savings on the morning after Brandon's call. And beside them, a summary Eleanor had prepared from her inquiries to 3 Manhattan hospitals, confirming the absence of any oncology record, surgical record, or diagnostic record associated with Brandon's name and date of birth in the relevant time frame. Theft by deception, Tommy said. Felony level given the amount. The threshold in New York for a Class D felony is $3,000. $18,000 is well above it. He set his pen down. Brandon told his father he had cancer. He cried on the phone. He received $18,000 and used it to secure a lease on an apartment in Midtown Manhattan. The room was very quiet. Outside 31 floors below, Park Avenue moved with its usual indifference to the specific weight of specific moments. Eleanor had not spoken since I arrived. She sat with her hands folded on the ledger, watching me the way she had watched me in the hospital, giving me the room to process at the speed I needed to process without filling the space with reassurance that would have felt dishonest. Tommy leaned forward slightly. I need to ask you something directly, Ray. because what we do next depends on your answer. Ask, I said. Are you pursuing this because you want your children to face consequences? He held my gaze without apology. Or because you want documentation that what happened was real and protection for Maggie that cannot be undone? I had thought about this question before he asked it. I had thought about it in the hospital and at home and in the car on the way here, and I had arrived at an answer that I was reasonably certain was honest. Both, I said, and I am not ashamed of either one. Tommy nodded once slowly, as if I had confirmed something he had expected, but needed to hear stated plainly. Then he reached for his phone. I have a call with the APS investigator at 2 o'clock, he said. You should be here for it. Can you stay? I have nowhere else to be, I said. Outside the window, the Empire State Building stood exactly where it had always stood, indifferent and permanent, the way the best landmarks are there before the trouble started. Thereafter it ends, measuring the distance between the two with nothing more than their continued presence. Brandon and Diane landed at JFK on a Tuesday afternoon. I had installed the camera system 3 years ago at Maggie's suggestion after a package was stolen from our porch. It had proven useful in ways neither of us anticipated. Brandon got out first. He was tan in the way people get tan at Mexican resorts in November, evenly expensively the kind of color that announces itself against a gray New York afternoon. He was wearing a jacket I did not recognize and carrying a leather overnight bag that suggested this visit had been planned, not impulsive. He walked to the front door with the particular stride of a man who believes he is about to have a difficult conversation, that he will nonetheless win because he has always won the difficult conversations before. Diane got out second. She stood beside the car for a moment, one hand on the door looking at the house with an expression I could not read clearly on the small screen, but which contained, I thought, something that was not confidence, something more cautious than that. I watched Brandon reach into his jacket pocket and produce a key. He inserted it into the lock. He turned it. Nothing happened. He turned it again with more force this time, the way people respond to mechanical failure by applying the same action with greater intensity as though the problem is effort rather than circumstance. The door did not open. He pulled the key out and looked at it, then looked at the door, then looked back at the key. Then he rang the bell. I set the phone down on the kitchen table and walked to the front door. Patricia was upstairs with Maggie. The house was quiet except for the low sound of the television from Maggie's room and the particular creak of the third stair that I had been meaning to fix since 2019 and had never gotten around to fixing, and now thought I probably never would, because some things become part of a house the way some things become part of a life, not because they are right, but because they have been there long enough to belong. I opened the door. Brandon's jaw was tight in the way it got when he was controlling something. He had his mother's jaw, the same clean line of it, and seeing it on his face in that particular configuration produced a sensation I had long since learned to recognize, and set aside the specific ache of loving someone and being disappointed by them at the same time, which is one of the more complicated emotional experiences available to a parent. You changed the locks, he said. Yes, I said, without telling us. You were in Mexico, I said. I sent a message. Diane had come up the path behind him. She was wearing sunglasses despite the overcast sky, which might have been affectation, or might have been that her eyes were tired from the flight. She stopped one step below Brandon and looked at me with the careful attention of someone assessing a situation before deciding how to enter it. Dad, she said. Her voice was measured warmer than Brandon's. She had always been better than her brother at calibrating tone to circumstance. Can we come in? It's cold out here. I'd like to talk out here, I said. Brandon's eyes narrowed. You're serious. I'm always serious, Brandon. You know that. You're going to make your own children stand on the porch. You tried your key before you rang the bell, I said. I watched you on the camera. You came here expecting to walk in, not to be invited. I think that tells us something about where we are. A muscle moved in Brandon's jaw. Diane reached up and removed her sunglasses, folding them with the careful precision of someone who needed something to do with their hands. Her eyes without the glasses were red at the rims, in a way that could have been the dry air on the plane, or could have been something else, and I did not make assumptions either way. Dad, Diane said, we want to explain. There are things you don't have the full picture on. I have a considerable picture, I said. Tommy Reyes has spent the last week helping me complete it. Brandon went very still. That stillness, the specific quality of it, the way it was different from ordinary stillness, the way it was the stillness of a person who has just understood that the game they were playing has changed in ways they were not prepared for, told me more than anything he had said since he got out of the car. What has Eleanor told you? He said. His voice had dropped. The tightness in his jaw had become something different, not controlled. Anger now, but something with more caution in it, something that registered for the first time since his car had pulled up to my curb, that he was not operating on the information he thought he was operating on. Eleanor showed me records, I said. You created those records. She had no right to access our financial. She had authorized access, I said, to records that contained deposits from my account. The deposits were mine. What happened to them after they left my account is also documented. Diane made a sound, not quite a word, something shorter than that, a breath that carried the weight of someone who has been waiting for a specific moment to arrive and has just understood that it has arrived and is not what they hoped it would be. How much does he know? She said. Not to me, to Brandon. Brandon did not answer her. He was looking at me with an expression that had cycled through anger and calculation and arrived at something rawer than either the face of a 41-year-old man standing on his father's porch in the cold December air, understanding for the first time that the conversation he had prepared for on the flight home from Cabo was not the conversation that was actually happening. Come inside, I said. Both of you. I'll make coffee. We'll sit down and go through it. They came inside, not because I had relented, not because the anger between us had resolved into something warmer, but because there are conversations that need a table between the people having them, and a kitchen, and something warm in a cup, and the ordinary gravity of a house that has held a family for 26 years, even when that family is in the process of becoming something it has not been before. I did not know walking ahead of them down the hallway what would come out of the next hour. I did not know whether Brandon would defend or deflect, or finally say something true. I did not know whether Diane's red-rimmed eyes meant remorse or exhaustion, or simply the particular discomfort of a person whose story is about to be examined in a light she did not choose. What I knew was that Patricia was upstairs with Maggie, that the locks had been changed, that Tommy Reyes had filed 3 separate reports with 3 separate agencies, and that whatever happened in my kitchen in the next 60 minutes, the foundation beneath it was already different from the foundation that had existed 3 weeks ago. I filled the kettle and set it on the stove. Behind me, my children sat down at the table where they had eaten 1,000 meals and waited. The kettle took 4 minutes to boil. Nobody spoke during those 4 minutes. Brandon sat at the end of the table closest to the window, where he had sat since he was old enough to choose his own seat, which was somewhere around age 7. Diane sat across from him, her sunglasses folded on the table beside her hands. I stood at the counter with my back partially to them, which was not a strategic choice. I simply needed something to do with my body, while the water heated and making coffee was something to do. When I set the cups down and sat across from them both, Brandon leaned forward with his forearms on the table and said, "Dad, before you say anything, I want you to understand that what Eleanor showed you is one interpretation of a complicated situation." "It is not an interpretation," I said. "It is a bank record. Bank records have context." "They do," I said. "The context is that $67,000 left your mother's medical savings account over 14 months using a power of attorney. You asked me to sign on an evening when she had just come through a difficult episode, and I was frightened and not reading carefully." I looked at him steadily. "The context makes it worse, Brandon, not better." His jaw worked. "I was managing things. You were overwhelmed. Someone had to step in. Stepping in would have meant telling me what you were doing and asking whether I agreed." I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup, one full grip, one careful around the splint. "What you did was the opposite of that." Diane cleared her throat. "Dad, the GoFundMe. You photographed me," I said, "in a hospital room, without my knowledge, while I was looking out the window." I turned to her directly. "You stood in my doorway, took a picture of your injured father, and used it to raise $23,000 from my colleagues and neighbors before you boarded a flight to Mexico." Diane's chin came up in the way it had since she was a teenager. Not defiance exactly, something more complicated, the expression of a person who has been caught doing something they had a reason for and is trying to decide whether the reason will hold up. "People wanted to help," she said. "They were asking what they could do. I gave them a way to do something. You gave them a way to give money to your own account," I said, while telling them it was for my recovery. "That is not helping, Diane. That has a different name, and the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York has it on file." The color left her face with a speed that told me the U.S. Attorney reference was not something she had expected me to know about yet. Her attorney had contacted Tommy's office, which meant she was aware a referral had been made, but there was a difference between knowing something existed and hearing it said plainly across a kitchen table by the person it had been done to. "You went to the feds," Brandon said. His voice was flat and tight, the voice of someone working very hard to sound controlled. "Tommy filed the appropriate reports with the appropriate agencies," I said. "Adult Protective Services opened a case Monday. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division received documentation about 14 months of unreported rental income from a property on Long Island that was listed on a short-term rental platform under my name without my permission." Brandon pushed back from the table slightly. Not standing, just creating distance, the physical instinct of someone who feels a space closing around them. "That house was sitting empty," he said. "It was generating nothing. I was using a resource that wasn't being used." "It was my resource," I said. "My parents' house. You used my name, Brandon. You built a listing using photographs of rooms where my mother lived for 38 years and charged strangers to sleep in them. You collected the money and told me nothing." I paused. "Was there a version of that plan that you thought I would have agreed to if you had simply asked?" He did not answer. "The cancer," I said. Something happened to Brandon's face that I had not seen before. Not the controlled tightness from earlier. Not the calculating adjustment I had watched him perform since he sat down. Something underneath those things raw or less managed the expression of a person who has been carrying something heavy and has just heard it named out loud by someone who is not going to pretend it weighs less than it does. "Dad," he started. "You called me at 9:45 at night," I said. "You were crying. You said the word malignant, and I stopped sleeping properly for a week. I moved $18,000 out of savings the following morning because I was frightened for you, and I would have moved every dollar I had if that was what you needed." My voice did not shake. I was grateful for that, and I was also aware, in the way you are aware of things you are actively managing, that my gratitude for my own steadiness was itself an indication of how close I was to the edge of it. There was no diagnosis, there was no surgery, there was no cancer. Brandon pressed both hands flat on the table. His knuckles went white. I was in a bad place, he said. Financially, emotionally. I didn't know how else to ask. You could have told me the truth, I said. That you were struggling. That you needed help. I was already giving you $4,900 every month based on debts that did not exist. You could have asked me directly for more, and I would have had a conversation with you about it. I set my cup down. Instead, you told me you had cancer, and I believed you, because you are my son, and I did not think there was a version of you that would do that to me. Diane made a sound beside him, something compressed and involuntary, her hand going to her mouth, her eyes filling in a way that looked for the first time since she had walked through my front door like something that was not performance. I didn't know about the cancer, she said. Her voice was unsteady. Brandon, I didn't know. Brandon looked at his sister. Something passed between them that I could not fully read, not quite guilt, not quite blame. Something more tangled than either the language of siblings who have been making decisions together for years and have just discovered that some of those decisions were made separately. What do you want? Brandon said. He turned back to me and the rawness on his face had not gone away. An apology. Money back. What does this look like if it... What do you actually want from us? I had thought about this question before he asked it, because I had known from the moment Arthur had shown me the GoFundMe page at 4 a.m. in a hospital room in Queens that this question was coming, and that my answer to it mattered. I want you to understand what you did, I said. Not to me, to your mother. The account you drew from was built over 11 years to make sure that whatever happened, Maggie would be taken care of. Every dollar you took from it was a dollar I put there because I was afraid of the day I would not be able to take care of her myself. I looked at both of them. You took that money and you spent it on rent and restaurants and a deposit on an apartment in Midtown and a resort in Mexico. And while you were doing that, your mother's neurologist was trying to reach you to tell you she needed more care than I could provide alone, and neither of you called him back. The kitchen was very quiet. Upstairs, I could hear the low murmur of the television from Maggie's room, and beneath it, the soft, even sound of Patricia moving through her afternoon routine. The kettle on the stove had long since gone cold. Now, I said, you should speak to Tommy Reyes, both of you, separately with your own attorneys present. That is the appropriate next step. I stood. You know where the door is. Eleanor arrived at 6:30 with a pot of soup, not store-bought, not reheated from a container. Actual soup, the kind that announces itself from the front porch. Before the door opens, the kind that takes the better part of a day to make and smells like someone decided in the morning that another person was going to need something warm by evening and then acted on that decision without being asked. She handed it to me at the door in a heavy ceramic pot with both hands and said, "Chicken and root vegetables, Maggie's recipe from the card she gave me in 2016. I called Patricia to confirm the seasoning was still appropriate for her current diet. I stood in the doorway holding the pot and did not speak for a moment. Come in, I said. We ate at the kitchen table, the same table where Brandon and Diane had sat 4 hours earlier, which Eleanor knew because I had called her after they left. She had listened to the summary without interrupting, asked 2 questions, and then said she would come at 6:30 and bring food, which was not a question. The soup was very good. We ate most of it before either of us said anything that mattered, which felt correct. There are conversations that need the ordinary mechanics of a shared meal before they can begin the passing of bread, the sound of spoons, the small domestic rhythm of 2 people eating together in a warm kitchen while the December cold pressed against the windows outside. Patricia had settled Maggie for the evening. The house was quiet in the way it got quiet after 8 o'clock. A specific quality of stillness that I had come to find over the years more comforting than silence had any right to be. "How long did you know?" I asked. Eleanor set her spoon down, with the deliberate care she applied to most physical actions. "I knew something was wrong," she said. "From the afternoon Brandon came to my office. 2 years ago, March. He sat across from me the way clients sit when they have a specific outcome in mind and are hoping the conversation will lead there without their having to state it directly." She looked at her bowl. "He asked about powers of attorney in terms that were too precise for someone with no professional reason to understand the distinctions. He asked about jointly held accounts and what access looked like during a spouse's incapacity. He asked whether a trust could be contested after the fact, and under what circumstances. He was mapping the terrain," I said. "He was mapping the terrain," Eleanor confirmed. "I gave him general information because I had no grounds to refuse it. Estate law is not secret. But I noted the questions, and I noted the order in which he asked them, and when he left, I wrote them down in the ledger." "You started the ledger that day." "I started a section of it that day," she said. "The financial records came later when I was reviewing some documents for Janet Holloway, a mutual acquaintance, you may remember her. She and her husband came to your retirement dinner in 2018, and I discovered that the account statements she had asked me to look at contained regular incoming deposits from your account." Eleanor looked up. I recognized the amounts. They matched what Brandon had implied in a conversation I was not supposed to remember that he expected to be receiving. I refilled her cup from the pot on the stove without being asked the way she had brought soup, without being asked the small reciprocities that constitute a friendship between people who have known each other long enough to move past asking. "Why didn't you come to me then?" I said. I asked it without anger, because I had made peace with the answer before I heard it. Or at least I had made enough peace with it to ask the question as a genuine inquiry rather than an accusation. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Outside, a car passed on the street, its headlights sweeping briefly across the kitchen ceiling. "Because what I had was a pattern," she said. "Not proof of intent. A good defense attorney, and Brandon could afford a good defense attorney, would have argued that he was managing family finances with authorization and making reasonable decisions about allocation." She set both hands flat on the table. "To bring you something like that, Raymond, something that would overturn your understanding of your own family, I needed more than a pattern. I needed documentation sufficient to withstand scrutiny." She paused. "And I am also going to tell you the truth, which is that I was afraid. Not of Brandon. Of what knowing would do to you and Maggie. Of being the person who brought that into your house. The honesty of it landed differently than reassurance would have." Eleanor was not asking me to forgive her for waiting. She was telling me why she had waited, with the same precision she applied to everything, including her own failures. "When Arthur called you from the parking garage," I said. "When Arthur called me," she said, "I understood that the calculation had changed. You were already hurt. The damage was already happening. Protecting you from the knowledge was no longer possible. It was only a question of whether you would have it with documentation or without." She looked at me directly. I chose with. I thought about the red ledger. The months of careful notation, the tabbed sections, the copied statements with their highlighted figures. The work of a woman who had spent 82 years understanding that the people who kept records were the people who survived, and who had applied that understanding to someone else's survival, because she did not know yet when the right moment to deliver it would be. "There is one more thing I should tell you," Eleanor said. Her voice shifted slightly, not softer, but more careful, the way a person's voice shifts when they are approaching something they have been deciding whether to say. "Tell me," I said. "Brandon came back to my office," she said. 8 months after the first visit. He did not make an appointment. He appeared at the reception desk on a Thursday morning and asked whether I had time to discuss an estate matter. She straightened slightly in her chair. He asked me directly whether I was aware of any changes to your estate planning in the previous 3 years. He said he wanted to understand, as he put it, the current disposition of assets. I looked at her. He was checking, I said. He was checking, Eleanor said. I told him I was not in a position to discuss another client's estate and that he should consult his own attorney. He thanked me and left. She looked down at her soup bowl, which was nearly empty. He left. Raymond and I sat at my desk for 20 minutes afterward and thought about what it meant that he had asked. Not because he was concerned for you, but because he had plans that depended on a particular answer. The kitchen was warm. The soup pot on the stove still held enough for another bowl each. The December night pressed against the windows without getting in. He thought he knew what was coming, I said. He had been planning around it for at least 8 months, Eleanor said. Possibly longer. She folded her napkin with the neat precision she applied to everything. The trust changes that entirely. Whatever he was planning, it was built on a foundation that does not exist. I thought about Brandon sitting at this table 4 hours ago, knuckles white against the wood, asking me what I wanted from him. I thought about the question underneath that question, the one he had not asked yet, the one I suspected was still coming whenever he had enough distance from today to form it into words. Eleanor, I said. Thank you for the ledger, for the soup, for the Thursday morning in March 2 years ago when you wrote down questions that were not yours to answer and kept them anyway. She looked at me with the dry, measured warmth of a woman who had spent 82 years being thanked for things she considered simply correct behavior. Eat the rest of your soup, she said. It is better warm. Dr. Isaac Patel had been Maggie's neurologist for 6 years, and he had never once told us what we wanted to hear, when what we needed to hear was something different. That was not unkindness. It was the particular integrity of a physician who understood that softening a medical reality did not change the reality. It only delayed the patient's ability to respond to it. He was 52 years old, unhurried in the way that genuinely competent people are unhurried, and he had an office on East 77th Street that smelled like old books, and the faint trace of whatever tea he kept in the ceramic mug that was always on his desk, always half empty. I had come alone. Patricia was with Maggie. The December morning was cold and clear, and I had taken the subway rather than asking Arthur to drive me, because I needed the 40 minutes of motion, the specific anonymous rhythm of the New York City transit system, to prepare myself for whatever the appointment contained. Dr. Patel looked at the splint on my wrist when I sat down, then at my face, then at the wrist again. "How are the ribs?" he said. "Improving," I said. "I came to talk about Maggie, and about something else." He nodded and set his pen down, which was his way of indicating that he was fully present, and the desk was no longer between us in the way desks can be between people. "I need to know," I said, "whether you ever contacted Brandon or Diane directly about Maggie's condition." Dr. Patel looked at me for a long moment. His expression did not change into discomfort. Exactly, it changed into the expression of a man who had been waiting for a question to be asked and had prepared an honest answer for it. "Yes," he said. "Twice." The word landed the way I had expected it to land, which did not make it land any lighter. "Tell me," I said. "The first time was 14 months ago. Maggie had come through a difficult Q2 falls, one requiring an urgent visit to the clinic and a progression in her tremor severity that the medication adjustment had partially addressed but not resolved. Dr. Patel had called Brandon directly using the emergency contact information on file which I had updated 2 years ago to include both children at their request. Brandon had answered. Dr. Patel had explained the situation carefully, that Maggie's care needs were increasing beyond what a single caregiver, regardless of dedication, could safely manage alone. That professional support was not a luxury at this stage but a medical recommendation. That he would be happy to speak with Brandon and Diane together if that was helpful. Brandon had said he would discuss it with his sister and get back to the doctor within the week. He had not called back. I followed up by email 3 weeks later, Dr. Patel said. The address on file. I received no response. The second time, I said. 8 months ago. Diane had accompanied me to a routine appointment, one of the few times either child had come to the clinic, and I had been glad of it, had thought it meant something. Dr. Patel had taken the opportunity to speak with her directly after the examination, while I was in the waiting area filling out updated paperwork. He had told her the same things he had told Brandon, that Maggie needed more consistent professional support, that the progression of her Parkinson's made certain daily tasks increasingly unsafe for her to manage, with only intermittent help, that the time to arrange a care structure was before a crisis rather than after one. Diane had thanked him. She had said she and Brandon were looking into options. She had said her father was doing an incredible job and that the family was very lucky to have him. She had not followed up. I should have been more direct with you, Dr. Patel said. He said it the way Eleanor had said her version of the same admission plainly, without dressing it in excessive apology. I made an assumption that the family was communicating. In my experience, when adult children accompany a parent to an appointment and ask appropriate questions, it usually means they are engaged with the situation. He looked at me steadily. I was wrong about that. You were not wrong about the situation, I said. Only about who was paying attention to it. He was quiet for a moment. Outside his window, East 77th Street moved with its ordinary Tuesday morning pace, a delivery truck, 2 women with a stroller, a man in a long coat walking a dog that was not interested in walking anywhere in particular. The care she's receiving now, Dr. Patel said carefully, is what she should have had a year ago. I heard him. I let the sentence sit in the room for a moment before I responded, because it deserved that. The weight of a year, the 14 months between his first call to Brandon and the night of my accident, the progression that had continued while the children he had contacted made other plans. She's responding well to the current structure, I said. Patricia is excellent. She is, he said. I've spoken with her twice since she started. Very thorough. He picked up his pen again, which was his way of indicating that we were returning to the clinical portion of the visit. I want to discuss the medication schedule. There are 2 adjustments I'd like to make based on last month's observations. We spent 30 minutes on Maggie's treatment plan. I took notes in the small notebook I carried for medical appointments, writing carefully with my right hand, and Dr. Patel answered every question I asked, with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything. On the subway home, I thought about the 14 months. I did not allow myself to stay inside that thought for long. It was the kind of thought that, if you let it, would take up permanent residence and pay no rent. But I stayed long enough to understand something I had been circling without landing on. Brandon and Diane had not been indifferent to Maggie's condition because they did not know about it. They had been indifferent because knowing about it would have required them to do something about it, and doing something about it would have cost them time and money and effort. They had decided at some point I could not precisely identify to spend elsewhere. The train moved through the tunnel beneath the city, loud and dark, and absolutely certain of its direction. I opened my notebook and looked at the medication adjustments Dr. Patel had recommended. Then I turned to a clean page and wrote Maggie's name at the top, the way I always did when I was starting a new section of notes, her name first, because she was the reason for all of it. And that order mattered. I do not use social media. I had created an account sometime around 2019 at Maggie's suggestion, logged in 4 times, found it disorienting, and had not returned since. Arthur, however, used it regularly. He had explained once that it was useful for keeping track of people he had known for 40 years, without the obligation of actual conversation, which was either the best or worst reason to use a technology depending entirely on how you felt about the people you were tracking. He texted me at 7:45 on a Thursday morning in January. "Call me when you're up. Something you need to see." I called him at 7:46. "There's a woman named Cheryl Marcus," Arthur said without preamble. She worked with Diane for 3 years at the agency that managed her social media contracts. She posted something last night. "It has more shares than Diane's original video." The screenshot arrived while we were still on the phone. I read it at the kitchen table while my coffee went cold. Cheryl had written 11 paragraphs with the clarity of someone who had been holding information too long and had finally decided that holding it was the wrong choice. The first thing she described was the production of Diane's video. She had been in a group chat when Diane sent a draft link from Cabo timestamped 11:47 in the evening, asking whether the lighting was good enough. 3 follow-up messages discussed caption options. The 12-minute video in which Diane had wept about her father had been reviewed for production quality before it was posted. The second thing Cheryl described was the sponsorship. Diane's Cabo trip had been partially funded by a resort partnership requiring disclosure under Federal Trade Commission guidelines. Diane's posts had included no such disclosure. Cheryl had filed an FTC complaint the previous morning. The third thing stopped me completely. 14 months ago, at an agency event, Diane had shown Cheryl her phone and laughed. What she had been showing her was the GoFundMe page still in draft, not yet live, with a caption that read, according to Cheryl's recollection, something to the effect of, "Watch how fast this fills up. These people will donate to anything." I read that sentence 3 times. Arthur had not spoken since telling me to look at the screenshot, which was the correct decision. There are things that need to be read in quiet. "The comments have turned," he said finally. "On Diane's original video, it does not look good for her." "No," I said. "I imagine it does not." I called Tommy at 8:15. He had already seen it. Eleanor had forwarded it to him at 6 in the morning, because Eleanor read everything and slept apparently very little. "The FTC complaint adds pressure," Tommy said. "It also establishes a documented pattern that a prosecutor finds useful." He paused. "I also received a call this morning from the New York Department of State Division of Licensing Services. They have opened a review of Brandon's real estate broker license. Using your name and credentials without authorization constitutes a violation of his fiduciary obligations. His ability to transact real estate in New York State is suspended pending the outcome, which could take 6 months, possibly longer." I set my coffee down and looked out the window at the oak tree Maggie and I had planted in 1998. The tree was very tall now. It had been growing for 27 years, without being asked to, which was more than I could say for certain other things I had invested in during that same period. Brandon called at 9:30. His voice carried none of the anger from December, only the quality of someone who had been awake for hours processing things that had arrived faster than he was prepared for. "Is there any version of this," he said, "where we sit down and work something out before it goes further?" I thought about the question honestly, because he had asked it without performance, and that absence deserved a real answer. "The legal processes were put in motion because of documented actions," I said. "Tommy can speak to you about cooperation. But if you are asking whether I am still your father, I am. What has changed is what it costs to be in my life." He was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know how to start," he said. His voice was unsteady in a way it had not been in December. "I know," I said. "Neither did I. But I started anyway." Tommy scheduled the meeting for a Monday morning and told Brandon and Diane only that it concerned the estate. He did not tell them what specifically. In my experience, which now included considerably more legal process than it had 2 months ago, that kind of omission was not accidental. They arrived together. Brandon wore a jacket I had not seen before, new or recently purchased, the kind of thing a person buys when they want to feel prepared. Diane came in behind him and stopped when she saw Eleanor sitting in the chair beside mine. Something moved across Brandon's face. Not surprise exactly. More like a man watching a door close that he had been hoping to keep open. Tommy waited until everyone was seated. Then he opened the folder on the desk and turned it toward the center of the table so that both Brandon and Diane could see the cover page. 3 years ago, Tommy said, "Your father established a revocable living trust under New York law. Every signature was witnessed by 2 independent parties and notarized at this office. I want to state that clearly before we go any further, because the validity of this document is not a question. It has already been reviewed by 2 independent estate attorneys at your father's request." Diane looked at the cover page. Then she looked at me. "The 2015 will," she said. Her voice was very careful. "Is no longer operative," Tommy said. "It was superseded by the trust 3 years ago." Brandon had not moved since Tommy began speaking. He sat with both hands on the table, very still, in a way that reminded me of the stillness I had seen on my front porch in December, the stillness of a person whose internal calculation has just encountered a figure that does not match the one they were running. Tommy walked through the provisions. The entirety of my estate, both properties, the retirement accounts, the savings held in trust, administered by Tommy himself. Purpose Maggie's medical care for the remainder of her life. Remainder upon her passing, directed to the Parkinson's Foundation Research Fund in Eleanor's name. Brandon and Diane were not named. Diane's chin trembled. She pressed her lips together and looked at the table in front of her, and I watched her work through something internally, not grief exactly, but the specific reckoning of a person who has built plans on a foundation and has just learned the foundation was not there. "You can't," she started. "It was done 3 years ago," Tommy said gently but without yielding, "with proper execution and full legal effect." Brandon looked at me, not with anger that surprised me, with something quieter and harder to name, the expression of a 41-year-old man sitting across from his father in a law office in January, understanding that the version of the future he had been living toward was not the future that was actually coming. "Was there ever a version of this," he said slowly, "that ended differently?" The question was genuine. I heard it land as genuine, which meant it deserved a genuine answer. "Yes," I said. "For a long time there was." Brandon nodded once. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. Diane followed him to the door without looking back. When they were gone, the room was very quiet. January light fell through Tommy's window across the table, clean and without warmth, the way January light in New York always is present, so on, without pretending to be something it is not. Eleanor rested her hand on the ledger in her lap and said nothing. Outside, the city continued exactly as it always had. The 15th of February arrived, the way all recurring dates arrive, without announcement, without ceremony. Simply present in the morning, the way the morning always is. I sat at the kitchen table, with coffee that was still hot, and opened my banking application, for the first time since the night in the hospital, when I had canceled the transfer, with one functioning hand, and a clarity I had not asked for, but had been given anyway. The scheduled payment that had once appeared on this screen. Family support, $4,900, recurring monthly, was gone. In its place was simply a balance, a number that belonged entirely to its stated purpose. I had set up 3 accounts the previous week. I opened them now in order. The first was Maggie's medical fund, the rebuilt version, of what had been drawn down the account I intended to spend the rest of my working years restoring to what it should have been. The second was an emergency reserve because 68 years of living had taught me that emergencies did not schedule themselves around your preparedness. The third was a contribution account for the Parkinson's Foundation in Eleanor's name because Eleanor had kept records when keeping records was the harder choice, and that deserved acknowledgement that outlasted a dinner and a pot of soup. I divided the $4,900 among the 3 accounts and pressed confirm. Then I went to find Maggie. She was in her chair by the window where the February light came through, thin and pale and honest. I sat beside her and took her hand, and she turned and looked at me in the way she had looked at me for 43 years, that specific quality of attention that I had never been able to describe and had long since stopped trying to. "Ray," she said. Just my name, the way she had always said it. "Maggie," I said. Outside the oak tree stood exactly where we had planted it in 1998, bare in the winter, entirely certain of itself, waiting, without impatience, for whatever came next. I spent 31 years counting other people's numbers. I never thought I would need someone to count mine for me. This grandpa story is not one I am proud of. I trusted too long, asked too few questions, and confused loyalty with wisdom. Do not make that mistake. Do not wait for a hospital bed and a red ledger to show you what was always in front of you. Check the records. Ask the hard questions early. The people who truly love you will not be offended. My personal opinion, and I say this as a man who has lived 68 years, love without accountability is not love. It is permission. God placed Eleanor, Arthur, and Carol in my life at exactly the right moment, and I am grateful every single day that I was still here to receive what they brought. This family story taught me that the most dangerous assumption is believing that silence means everything is fine. And this family story also taught me that it is never too late to redirect what you have built toward what actually matters. If this grandpa story reached something inside you, a memory, a worry, a conversation you have been avoiding, leave a comment below. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means the world. A note going forward, some upcoming stories contain fictional details added for deeper impact. If that is not the kind of content you are looking for, we completely understand. Please feel free to find what fits you best.